for the lost time. What I want us to look at is the discourse of decolonizing labor laws and repossessing subaltern epistemologies. And my presentation obviously is going to come from a South African and Namibian context, placing significant focus or emphasis on the mining sector. Now, obviously, most of us would want to understand and appreciate the fact that the mining sector largely does attract a lot of revenue and can actually be defining to any country's economy. And what we have noticed more often than not is that the mining sector is benefiting largely Western multinational corporations, and it largely is excluding the best interests of what we would call indigenous people. And the primary basis for this is that we have legal systems or a labor regulatory regime that seems to be cultured or driven or underpinned or framed from a Western perspective at the expense of what we call African indigenous value systems. And for the purpose of this particular presentation, the key aspect of Ubuntu, when you look at the post colonial narrative, most of the legal framework that we have for both South Africa and Namibia has largely just carried over from the apartheid regime that we've heard, and has not necessarily addressed or talked to the cultural aspects and value systems of the indigenous people. So to that extent, I am problematizing the nature of the labor laws that we have insofar as they apply to the mining sector. Obviously, one would ask, if you are going to talk about labor laws, why not talk about them holistically? But the point is that in the mining sectors in particular, we have seen that African indigents have been used more as slave labor, generating excessive revenue for the investors, with little being recouped and no change of their lifestyle and welfare in any particular context. So what we are trying to look at here in this particular context as regards to the presentation is obviously the fact that we must understand the whole issue of labor relations in the mining sector from a socio-political and economic context, and do understand also how the labor regulation that we have probably in the African context has not really changed from what we have seen in the apartheid or the colonial era. And of course, to try to look at what we have to do in order to address this particular gap in our regulatory framework, and not just the regulatory framework, but also in the ideological, conceptual frameworks of legal education. Because without addressing what is taught in the law schools, those that become practitioners and those that become drafters of these labor laws will continue to perpetuate what we call the exploitation of the African indigents in this particular context. I would have loved you to see some of the pictures that I have here, which depict mining that is during the apartheid era, where you would see quite a lot of slave akin practices, African workers or African indigents working in harsh environments and coming from all largely parts of Africa. So, if you would think about mining, particularly where it started in South Africa, you would realize that most of the workers would come from places such as Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, Lesotho, amongst others. And of course, what you would find there is that they had appalling conditions of living, where they had to be subjected to certain chiefs in terms of occupying residential places, and of course where they would be almost like kept within enclosures so that they are not seen to be taking any mineral resources. So indeed, it was akin to extreme exploitation of the African people. And what we then, of course, tend to understand is that At a later stage, that's why you have seen in many instances such a movement such as a hashtag fees must fall and roads must fall coming up, because there is really no substantive transformation that we are seeing in some of these particular sectors. You still see child labor. You still see, mine workers living in appalling conditions, near like shack environments. And I'm going to give a prime example of what we found in South Africa with regards to the Marikana massacre at a later stage in this particular presentation. So what we find from a historical perspective is that mine workers obviously have always been the weaker party to the employment relationship, and they are always weaker parties to, a platform or activity which is regarded as being capital intensive, in a practice in which mostly all the resources are exploited by external parties, and the revenue being repatriated to the originating countries of these corporates. And as such, you find that the employment relationships that we always find are skewed, akin to slavery in any particular context. And you find people like Pelders and Nelson trying to typify the living conditions of mine workers from 8 mines in South Africa, showing how atrocious and largely, inhumane the conditions would have been at the time. And of course, still would have to interrogate such particular living conditions in the context of what we see today. And of course, some may say with the advent of human rights, which is a discourse, of course, that we may accept, but which is not in itself adequate to the African context, because you have seen and do accept that certain forms of human rights, as they are introduced, are not per se in conformity with our African value systems, norms, and creeds in that particular context. And hence, I'm very careful for the purpose of this presentation not to want to rely so much on the human rights discourse, though it may be partly useful to the extent that you look at labor from the perspective of core labor standards and also the ILO regime. But I would prefer that we look at the concept of Ubuntu, because itself, it defines the aspect of humaneness in labor relations. And when you question such particular issues, you then are able to see that if we had placed Ubuntu as the instructive tool or system for defining our labor, laws, then perhaps would have a significant difference, in the sense that if you are because I am, then no one would want to profit at the expense of another party, and which is a problem that we see endemic. We see also because of the fact that we have not used Ubuntu construction and used human rights discourse. When we talk of fair wages, for example, in the mining sector, we can see reason in advancing a capitalist agenda which simply says, as long as you give wages that sustain businesses, that is condonable. However, we need to understand that the same, system has been prevailing without so much a change in the, way of living of the same, mine workers. And I'll give practical examples of this particular argumentation that I'm giving in context. And so you tend to find also that when there was a discovery of gold, for example, in the Transvaal area in South Africa, there was this desire or quest to rely on cheap labor, and in many instances where corporates actually found this as a competitive advantage in doing their business, and which are practices, when you look at it fast forward from a post-colonial perspective, you still find in contemporary institutions like the World Bank and IMF in their discourses of the ease of doing business index, where you push regulatory standards down in order to attract more investors and to make as much profit as possible. And we are going to also problematize that particular pattern and trend in the mining sector, insofar as what Karl Marx pointed to in terms of what we call capitalist exploitation of labor, so to speak. And therefore, what you saw in the mining sector at the time, the independence era, was the fact that you saw a lot of labor practices which were characterized by exploitation of cheap labor of the African indigents. You would see migratory labor from Southern Africa Development Community countries, which I've already mentioned: Malawi, Lesotho, Zambia, Zimbabwe. And all this offered a pool of cheap labor, and which actually allowed for maximum or rip-off profits that were realized, of course, by those corporates. However, on a positive note, around the 1960s, you start seeing a pattern of a transformation in the attitude towards cheap labor. And these patterns are largely driven by Tanzania and Zambia. And you note that the reason for this particular pattern is the fact that in the 1960s, both Tanzania and Zambia were obtaining or were able to acquire their independence. Tanzania in 1961 December, and Zambia in 1964. And what they did was they started to vigorously oppose such exploitation of African indigents in the mines. And what we saw was that the Anglo American Corporation, which of course could be abbreviated as ACC, then sought to ensure that they also leveraged to have better, remuneration for the workers. But this was starkly resisted actually by owners of mines who rejected the same position because they wanted to sustain the concept of cheap labor. And this was advanced by people such as Mendes and Betteler. And because of this, we started to see the same pattern of incessant exploitation. I can give an example here of the salaries. In 1977, for example, in both South Africa and Namibia, a mine worker was paid around 150, rands, or in 150 Namibian dollars, which is the same because it trades at 1:1. But the required minimum wage at the time was supposed to be 217 rands in that particular context. And Arigi makes a statement with regards to this. He actually says that the real wage rate came to a customarily fixed level, at a level that would provide for the subsistence of a single worker while working in the capitalist sector, and a small margin to meet more of agent of cash requirements of his family. So, in essence, what Origi is saying here is the fact that whatever would be given to the mine worker from that 150 rands was largely to be retained by the same people through taxes and other forms of taxation regimes, with little remaining to sustain such mine workers' family. And of course, people would want to understand, have we made significant progress in that particular context post independence? And this is the most interesting part that you will notice. If, in fact, I give you an example of what happened in the year 2012. When it comes to the Marikana massacre, most of you are cognizant of that. Just by way of quick narrative, that you had about 3,000 workers who embarked on a strike to claim for an increase in salaries. At the point in 2012, they were earning 4,000 rands, which is an equivalent of 4,000 Namibian dollars, and they wanted an increase up to 12,000 rands. And interestingly and shockingly for all of you, nine executive directors for Lonmin, which is the company against which they were striking, would earn 45 million rands annually, whereas 22,000 workers by half a year would earn 44,000 collectively. And so many questions are asked. How can we sustain such disparities to have nine people earning that much amount and 22,000 earning equivalent amount, and no one sees anything wrong? In fact, when you look at the sector, that's platinum, with the largest reserves that you can find in the African context, It's actually significantly problematic to actually sustain this. But the reason why we have made sense of this so far is because of the labor regime that we have, which is Eurocentric, or which is driven by Eurocentric values of capitalism, amongst other things, and which excludes the crucial component of Ubuntu in this particular context. So, what do we have by way of legislation in terms of South Africa? So we have the Constitution itself, we have the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, we have the Labor Relations Act, we have the Employment Equity Act, Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Mine Health and Safety Act, all which regulate, labor matters. It's interesting to see that there is this litany of legislation, but it's also interesting to see the increasing pattern or numbers of strike actions that are taking place in South Africa, where we have such pieces of legislation, which simply gives an impression that what we call legislation is not talking to the social or cultural context, but it is simply superimposed, Eurocentric values and standards which do not reflect on the society in which they are being applied. And as a result, it exacerbates the levels of exploitation in that particular context. And agreeably, yes, all the profits that are made as a result of such exploitative labor regimes obviously would go to the supposed investors, which, of course, many of our governments seem to ignorantly try to protect in that particular context. And of course, I did mention, we all know by now what happened in Marikana with the massacre of, the 22 innocent mine workers for simply claiming their best interests in this particular context, which is troubling in an African context where there is the so-called aspect of, independence. It might be interesting for you to know that there are some scholars who still find it's sane enough to contend that there is progress that has been made insofar as labor regulations in the mineral sector, and they even contend that there's been an improvement in workers' rights and issues of health and safety. Unfortunately, because of the technological challenges here, I wanted to show you some of the houses that the Marikana workers currently, not at the point, currently live in, so that you can make a call on your own to say, have we actually seen a tangible change in the context of the welfare of the workers? And take note, if the workers are struggling to go underground to extract natural resources for the sake of one person, to benefit, then of course we must start asking questions in this particular context. And then you move to Namibia also, which also has another regulatory regime in terms of the labor realm. But interestingly, you will find that Zeka Alberto, who was a former legal advisor for Rosink Uranium, which has now been taken over by the Chinese, parastatal company, he mentioned something striking. He said Namibia's mining industry carries a high risk of industrial accidents due to the nature of mining operations. And of course, still, like South Africa, again, there's a litany of legislation that is the 1992 Labor Act, the health and safety regulations in the Namibian mining industry, amongst other things. And also, there is another, piece of legislation, which is an ordinance that was passed, some time back, but which ordinance actually is confusingly, essentially used at the same time as a repealed Labor Act in 1992, whereas we already have a 2004 Labor Act. So this 1968 ordinance, which of course did give fair health and safety protection to the workers, has been partly, sort of like discontinued in use and reintroduced again, with even up to today so much confusion as to which particular law should apply in the mining sector insofar as occupational health and safety is concerned. So you find that we have a myriad of pieces of legislation which are applicable, which creates a lot of confusion. But we still find again that pattern of exploitation continuing because of the confusion around the regulatory framework. Now, because of this litany of abuse that we have seen, obviously there must be calls for decolonization. If we contend that we have universities that have sound academics. In fact, I must put squarely this particular problem firstly within the universities, because if we are saying we are supposed to focus on place-based learning, universities as platforms for offering ideal solutions to the communities within which they are located, why are we not problematizing these issues from an Afrocentric perspective? And why do we find sanity in having laws which are modeled through alien systems or through acculturation, through westernization? And at the end of it all, we have supposedly good constitution, supposedly good labor laws, but which do not have rights which are accessible to the majority of our exploited mine workers. So it gets to a point where we must start talking about decolonizing our labor laws, because we can't continue with the current status quo. In fact, I've already articulated the fact that as long as our labor laws are modeled on capitalist lines, then we haven't yet started until we actually place emphasis on issues around Ubuntu. So, why do we want to decolonize the same labor laws? Because we don't want to follow the pattern of the ease of doing business index, which creates security of tenure for investors who exploit the so much and talked about revenue with little beneficiation, with little accrual, with little transfer of skills taking place. Most of these mine workers that we are talking about are employed in lower level positions, which of course are not managerial, and which does not entail a transfer of skills, transfer of managerial skills. And that's why you find in many instances when the same corporates leave, there are no employee share ownership schemes which allow for these mine workers to take over such operations and of course benefit their communities in the quest for sustainable development. And we wonder why we are always a platform of being pillaged of our resources without any tangible transformation and development in our communities. In fact, you find that where most of these companies have operated and they leave, they just leave unrehabilitated mining sites with no progress taking place thereafter. And therefore, if we amend the so-called labor laws that we have, of course, I've mentioned if we have employee share ownership schemes of our mine workers which are gainfully employed in the mining sector, they'll acquire the know-how of taking over the running of these mines. And of course, we will be able to retain most of the revenue that will be generated from the process of mining and empower our own people in this particular context. So this would be more crucial. Yes, someone is saying we should focus more on the less on the managerial concept. Of course, it is part and parcel of a package. When we look at the transformative discourses, there are numerous things that one has to look at. The transfer of skills, of course, the acquisition of technology and all the equipment necessary. Of course, the learning that takes place in institutions is part of the decolonial agenda. It's not just a one-sided component, but it's a holistic component that allows a broader thinking around discourses on how to control and run our own mining activities. Now, you might want to know why I have a problem with the current labor law regime. Of course, Karl Marx advances the theory of capitalist exploitation. And he says here that this capitalist exploitation aligns fully well with what certain classical economists such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo have pointed to insofar as business is concerned. It does not surprise many of us that because of this kind of capitalist exploitation agenda, We don't have a value addition. We do not have a beneficiation, like I mentioned. We don't have a transformative skew within the concept of mining. And what we tend to see is the belief that in the mining sector, we must have lower cost of doing business because mining is a capital intensive sector. Yet we notice more often than not evidence of a lot of revenue being externalized without so many questions being asked in that particular context. So exploitation, according to Smith and Ricardo and Quincy, constituted of producing surplus on net product over and above the cost of workers' subsistence and replacement of materials used up in production, and appropriation of that surplus by a class of non-reproductive owners of property in this particular context. And so what you tend to find to see is that exploitation defines itself in an instance where people make significant profits. And when they make those significant profits, they pay off the workers who they actually, obtain a cheap labor with the minimal of the process that they get, and the rest they pocket. And of course, we wonder why everyone wants to rush to the West now. Is it not that the West itself is sustained by exploiting African resources? Is it not that Asia itself is sustained by also exploiting our own natural resources in that particular context? And therefore, my contention is that we need to think broader and more deeply. And how can we do that? My thinking is that we need to go back to the drawing boards and start to see how we can place African value systems in the process of drafting or developing labor legislation in this particular context. It does not matter whether it's South Africa, Namibia, or any other African country for that matter. We must place the concept of, Afrocentric value systems of humaneness in the process of developing labor legislation. Of course, some can argue, where do you think such a particular, form of developing laws can be situated within the context of a globalized, village, or in a world that is largely capitalist? But of course, if we want to think about development, we must start to haggle and grapple with these issues. For your own information, for China to be where it is, if you read Lester McKinney and Davis, they talk about how they protected their own infant industries to grow up to where they are now. And it's not the same Africa now, largely dependent on the same China, which we would laugh at when we were in primary school, simply because the Chinese understood its standard. Yes, China had a socialist revolution, and we also can actually have a revolution which is Afrocentric and which is driven to ensure that we start harnessing the benefits of our process in this particular context. So what recommendations do I make? I have a few recommendations, if not a litany of recommendations. That is labor laws in both South Africa and Namibia, and just not in these two, but also in all African countries need to be decolonized. And of course, if we decolonize, obviously we are going to have laws that are reflective of the current demands and interests of the people, not this capitalist oriented discourse that has not taken us anywhere. Most of these countries that we're talking about have got over 40 to 50 years of independence, but with the majority of their people wallowing in poverty. But if you look at some of the countries where there is not even mineral endowment beyond one mineral component, like you look at the Arab states, they are far developed compared to most African countries, which have got a litany or a different assortment of mineral resources within them, but with chronic poverty. So, of course, to achieve the decolonization of labor laws, there's need to decolonize the minds of Africans in general, particularly policymakers, technocrats, for, of course, in my context, legal minds, because the kinds of jurisprudence that we are learning in universities is irrelevant to the context of, the decolonization and transformation agenda that we need for Africans. And such changes must be driven by transformation of all levels of education, from primary to tertiary levels, so that we start thinking from an Afrocentric and pro-African perspective. More specifically, legal education must be transformed to accommodate African value systems And in fact, in the broader context of the paper itself, as I will develop and obviously share with all colleagues at a later stage, you tend to understand that legal practitioners and legal academics right now are largely Eurocentric and pride themselves for such, but yet misdirecting themselves and engendering or driving poverty in their own countries. So, of course, we need to embrace decolonization in practice and in the lecture room. And that way, even what we tend to see in the minds will start changing in that particular context. So, I think based on the time, I would want to stop there, but I would be glad to share the presentation for now, and at a later stage, the article that, of course, is at an advanced stage of publishing once it's out. So I think that's largely what I wanted to share. It's very unfortunate. I would have wanted to show you pictorial evidence of this carnage that we're talking about, but it is what it is. I'm just glad that at least we are able to present and hopefully interact in that particular context. Thank you. I hope you were able to hear me. I just saw some comments that were on in the chat. For example, someone was saying better to use African philosophy to examine exploitation of African indigents by colonial investors and their colonial mode of production. Obviously, Jabul, that's why we are talking about Ubuntu and problematizing the Eurocentric perspective of developing of labor legislation. And I hope you understand, particularly from the perspective of comparative law, what I'm talking about. Most of your constitutions largely talk about reference to international law as a way or as a basis of formulating legislation. Yet we can actually also develop our own laws which can talk to the external standards in that particular context. So in this particular piece, I focus largely on the role of Ubuntu philosophy as a basis for, unyoking the so-called shackles that are posed by what we call Eurocentric labor laws in that particular context. Is there a presentation being shared? Well, I would have loved to share, but there was a problem, so I will still share the PowerPoint presentation. I hope the organizers will facilitate so that people can see what I was talking about. Of course, Volt says that legislation means nothing without political power of the people. Good point, because at the end of the day, what you are saying is largely the example of what we saw in Marikana, legislation which gives right for collective bargaining, legislation which gives supposed right for strike actions. But when people start partaking of such strike actions, the same politicians who have the same power will descend upon the people and attack them because they are protecting the investors' interest in this particular context. So it is a valuable point. But how can people get that political power? Of course, this is what we should start thinking. Will they get it by us pursuing a Eurocentric narrative? Or they can only get it by us going back to the drawing board and collecting the same subaltern epistemologies that I've been talking about. They're frowned upon value systems, but which are of value to us in this particular context. And Jabo says a mining company taken over by the Chinese. Yes, Rosink was taken over by the Chinese. And in fact, you may want to study, interestingly, the patterns that are developing here in Namibia in around Chinese activities and the mining sector. You will be quite surprised. Yes, and then of course, yes, he says China had a socialist revolution. Yes, and we also need an Afrocentric perspective to our own revolution. And perhaps in that particular context, if we're able to do that, we'll have progress. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's as far as I could, present. I hope I made sense. But the bottom line is we need to relook our labor laws to the extent that they impact on the mining sector to ensure gainful employment and to also ensure a transformation within our societies. Thank you.